Hey everybody, welcome to Chapter 15, Lesson 1, and we're going to be talking about John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who wins the election of 1960, and there are going to be a number of firsts with him winning the election of 1960. For example, it's the first time that a candidate makes successful and substantial use of television to campaign and win an election, as a for instance. But there are other things as well that President Kennedy does, that his presidency will do to help change American society. So in addition to just having a president that is just in general overall TV savvy, we're going to also expect a president to keep his or her faith out of politics, which prior to this was something that often presidents would bring into their politics. But ever since Kennedy's election, the private faith life of our president hasn't been as important as it was before Kennedy's election. So let's just take a step back and take a look at this race between Kennedy and his opponent. The Republican candidate for this election was Richard Nixon, and the Democrat, of course, was Kennedy. And what's interesting here is that when it comes to foreign policy, Kennedy and Nixon had very similar approaches. They both, for example, really took this perspective that communism was kind of anti-moral, it was anti-ethical, that it was against what it meant to be an American, whether it was going against God or enslaving men by removing their free will, destroying justice. And Nixon as a Republican and Kennedy as a Democrat, they shared this perspective that communism was ethically evil. But they also, and here's where it's interesting, Nixon, who was actually Eisenhower's vice president, and Kennedy himself did not like massive retaliation. They preferred Truman's limited wars because of the risk that comes with using massive retaliation, namely nuclear war. Now, there were definitely some key differences between the two candidates, so please don't think that there weren't key differences between the two candidates. So, for example, Nixon had some different opinions with Kennedy on things like deficit spending. They had fears about inflation. Nixon was a very formal candidate. He was a very traditional candidate, the kind of guy who would have been right at home running for president in the 1920s, 1930s. Kennedy was younger. He was a World War II veteran. And he was unique in the sense that Kennedy was Catholic, and he had to deal with this again and again and again as part of his makeup during the campaign. So, for example, here's one quote from Kennedy that points out how often and how frequently he would have to defend this issue of his personal faith. He says, "I am not a Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who also happens to be a Catholic." Remember, we had never had a Catholic president before. And the fear here came from those people who were Protestant and said, well, the Pope tells Catholics what to do. The Pope is in charge of the Catholic faith and all Catholic people. What happens if the Pope tells John Fitzgerald Kennedy to go to war with the Soviets? Will he do it? That kind of fear, kind of irrational thinking about the Pope controlling Kennedy really kind of got certain people upset, especially in the South and the Deep South. So to kind of ease those concerns, Kennedy talks a lot about that separation of church and state, that I'm a Democratic candidate for president. There's a dividing line, a wall between church and state. Nixon didn't have that fear. Nixon didn't have that worry. But what Nixon and Kennedy both talked about, Kennedy more than Nixon in particular, was something he called the missile gap. And here's an example. It's supposed to be a gap that existed between the amount of nuclear missiles we had as a nation and the Soviets had as a nation. Now, if you look at this actual statistical chart, you can see that in the 1960s, when Kennedy is running, we had way freaking more missiles than the Soviet Union, but we didn't know that. Our intelligence was bad. Kennedy and others actually had thought that the Soviet Union had more nuclear missiles than we did. So there was a real fear over the Soviets being able to strike us first and defeat us so badly we wouldn't be able to win in a nuclear war. Kennedy wants to address that by saying we need to build more nuclear missiles and make sure we have them available in case a limited war doesn't work. The last thing I want to point out, and we're going to do some work with this in class, is just how TV savvy Kennedy really was and how TV savvy, Nixon wasn't. This was one of the first televised debates that we're going to see between presidential candidates. And in that debate, Kennedy prepares in such a way and appears on TV in such a way that he looks relaxed and comfortable. He looks natural. He connects to the voters. He actually talks to us as viewers watching the television. Nixon looks uncomfortable. He looks awkward, can't sit properly. The suit that he chose doesn't look good on TV, as a for instance. When he's debating, Nixon doesn't look at us as a people. He instead looks at Kennedy. He addresses Kennedy like he's debating Kennedy. Kennedy looks into the TV screen at us. These are examples, and there are many others we'll talk about tomorrow, about how Kennedy was TV savvy and Nixon wasn't. The bottom line is, you take all of these things together, even though they're similar on foreign policy, Kennedy's approach to the missile gap, Kennedy's approach to the issue of his faith, is going to help him convince people to elect him into office, and he's going to win. So as Kennedy takes office in 1961, what we're going to see is he's going to look to create his own agenda. He's going to want to say, you know what, we need to fix society's problems. It's not just a matter of you wanting a TV-savvy president. It's not a matter of you wanting me to keep my faith, my Catholic faith, out of my presidency. But you're also looking to me to try and fix problems. But the answer to that question of whether or not Kennedy's going to be able to fix problems is actually mixed, because there's going to be a number of things keeping him back. Fear is going to prevent opportunity from being fulfilled. Beliefs in political ideology is going to prevent compromise. Racism is going to prevent change. And things like that will keep government from being able to fix society. There will be some times when government can help fix society's problems. We'll see progress made on women's rights. We'll see opportunity to help those that are developmentally challenged. We'll see economic growth continue to be encouraged under Kennedy. But it's not going to be something during his limited time in office that he's going to be able to definitely say, government comes to the rescue of society. So Kennedy, in his beginning part of his first 100 days, says, you know what, I have a new idea, and I'm calling this idea, these changes I want to see in place, I'm calling it the New Frontier. And the New Frontier is really designed to challenge Americans to get more involved in helping their country. You can see Kennedy here at his inaugural address, and we're going to actually do some work in class on his inaugural address. And he issues a hallmark challenge to Americans. He says, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. It's this idea that government can't do it all by itself. Government needs the help of its people. Washington is only as effective as its people want it to be. So as he kind of develops this, this need, this encouragement, he says, come on, people, I want you to help me out. He says, okay, what do I want to get done? How can I actually fix some of our problems? He says, well, we definitely need more funding for education. Eisenhower cut that. We didn't get that aid for schools. He says we're going to need more health insurance for the elderly. Remember, Truman wanted to get national health insurance. Eisenhower said, nope, not going to do it, creeping socialism. So Kennedy's going to kind of float some of these ideas out towards Congress, and he's going to say, you know what, let's cut taxes to get the economy moving. Let's get health insurance for the elderly. Let's get this funding for schools. And all of these things that the president proposes, he's not going to get. And he's not going to get it because the conservative coalition, Republicans and Southern Democrats together, are going to unite and keep many of those proposals from being passed. And you can see that on this map. What you have in red are all the states that voted Republican for Richard Nixon. That's a lot of states. And in the South, you'll see there are some Republican states, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, Florida, and also some states here that voted for Robert Byrd, the States' Rights Party candidate. These are the white Southern Democrats that will join with Republicans to shoot down Kennedy's proposals, because these proposals don't just help whites, they also help ethnic minorities. And we know that in America, in a time of segregation, that is not what some Southern whites want. So Congress is going to shoot down the tax cuts Kennedy wants to get the economy moving. They're afraid of inflation. If you put too much money in people's pockets, that's going to put more money into the economy. That's going to lower the value of the dollar. Prices will rise, inflation will happen. We're not going to give health insurance, we're not going to give aid to schools. Kennedy did have some successes. He does use deficit spending, he does create some jobs and strengthen the economy by putting the government to work with deficit spending. He does get Congress to agree to raise the minimum wage in the 1960s. The minimum wage had stayed frozen for a while, all the way through the latter part of the 1950s. It had been stuck at $1, and he gets them to raise it. He does advance women's rights. Kennedy creates the Commission on the Status of Women. It was a presidential commission, one of the first that had ever been created, that says we need to stop discrimination and provide fair pay for women, something we still have not yet done. Still haven't provided for an absolute legal guarantee for fair pay for women. And he begins for the first time an investigation into a portion or a population of Americans that have been ignored for a long time, those that are developmentally challenged. And he creates the panel on mental retardation. And it's the first time our government says we have a huge population of people that really could benefit from a better life and could be useful, productive members of society if we only took the time to care for them. So those are some of the changes that Kennedy will get through, and some of the changes that he can't get through. But it is, an easy way to kind of recognize that his presidency is kind of a mixed bag. There is something else important that happens during his term, though, that's definitely worth discussing, and that is going to be changes to the Supreme Court that are made, encouraged by our to society by our Supreme Court. The Supreme Court and its Chief Justice Earl Warren are really going to push to make sure that everyone has access to the same rights. And Kennedy will support this kind of behavior by the Supreme Court to help change society. So let me give you an example of some of the things our Supreme Court did. In our country, one of the things that we had is, you see it right up here, the Constitution protects Americans against unfair government's actions and laws. That's the goal of the Constitution. But, for the longest time, what this meant was only what you see right here, highlighted. That the national government in Washington, D.C. couldn't treat you unfairly. States had different rules for everybody. Some states would do one thing, some states would do another. Well, what about a lawyer? Do I get access to a lawyer? In some states you did. In some states you didn't. What about freedom of speech? In some states that was restricted. In some states it wasn't. Search warrant protection. Some states you got it, some states you didn't. The Supreme Court is going to turn to something. It's going to turn to the 14th Amendment. And in the 14th Amendment is a statement about what you can see called here on this slide, due process of law. Due process of law is the idea that everyone should be treated fairly under the law before punished, regardless of where you live in our country. So, they pass a series of court cases that say no state shall deprive you of life, liberty, or property without treating you fairly. So what happens is now due process in our country includes three things. It's not just the Constitution making sure the government acts fairly and you're protected. It's understanding that it means the national government and state and local governments. They all have to treat you fairly before you can be punished. I'll give you several court cases that help you kind of understand that. One of them is Miranda v. Arizona. In Arizona, there wasn't protection for you if you were questioned by the police. So, for example, Ernesto Miranda signs a confession. He wasn't notified properly that anything he could say could be used against him in a court of law. So he's coerced into, he agrees to sign a confession. He didn't realize he didn't have to. He ends up going to jail. He sues. And the Supreme Court says you have the right to remain silent, not just in federal court, but you have the right to remain silent in state and local courts as well, as long as you're an adult. So there's an example of how that expands. Here's another one. It's called Reynolds v. Sims, and it changes the way we vote and count our votes. States used to be able to set up the system for voting however they wanted. So what I've done here is I've used Pennsylvania as an example. You could say that Pennsylvania could be divided up into however many districts, and each district would elect a person to Congress. So in this case, what do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 districts, and each one could elect a person to Congress. And, you know, there's differing populations in each region of Pennsylvania, right? Like Philly, Pittsburgh, they got a ton of people. Wilkes-Barre, Erie, got a lot of people. Harrisburg, you know, it's got some, not as much. This area of Pennsylvania, not a lot of people at all, right? Just kind of rural area. But each of them gets to elect a person. The Constitution says we can get 8 different seats in Congress, so we get to elect 8 people, and this way the amount of land that each person governs is the same. But this is unfair. Think about it. If we pretend that this person is just one person, so one person lives in this whole area, when that one person elects somebody to represent them, that person gets their own essential vote in Congress. One vote in Congress for one person. Here, Erie, 6 people in Erie get only one vote in Congress. Well, if this guy is 1 and he gets a vote, why don't they get 6 votes? How is it that this guy, these 2 guys, there's 3 guys, each of these get a vote in Congress, but all of these people that live in Pittsburgh, they only get 1 vote in Congress? This guy that lives in Philly only gets 1 vote in Congress? He gets the same representation as everybody who lives in the middle of nowhere? How is that even fair? So they look at this and they say, man, this really isn't fair at all. But let me give you a hint as to why they did this. Because in urban areas, you had an increasing number of ethnic minorities, which, for the sake of this argument, I'm highlighting green. And in the rural areas, the red squares, you had a lot of white people. Well, now look at this. We have so many ethnic minorities in these regions, but they get the same power in Congress, 1 vote, as just these few white people. How about that? So the Supreme Court hears an argument called Reynolds v. Sims, and they want to change the way we count votes using something called reapportionment. And it says that states can't draw up districts in a way that makes it unfair. Most Americans live in urban districts, but most states didn't reflect that. So a lot of ethnic minorities get their just 1 representation. It means that fewer white people get the same amount of representatives. This isn't fair. So Reynolds v. Sims says that each district has to have about the same population, not land. This should make everyone's influence more of the same. It's an idea called 1 man, 1 vote. Here is what that looks like. 1 man, 1 vote says everyone's votes have equal weight. Look here. This light blue area, that's 1 district. This little green one, that's a district. This red one, district, district, district. This gigantic one, district. There's but as many people in here, the same number of people in here, as there are in this little green dot. As many people in this white blue area as there are in this giant brown area. So the idea is that the Warren Supreme Court, using Reynolds v. Sims, gives more power to ethnic minorities, begins to really change the way society thinks of itself. The average person gets more protections, and it really changes the way people think about what's right and what's wrong for people that are accused of crimes and people that commit them, and people that want to keep their rights protected. And we'll talk more about this in class tomorrow. Oh, and by the way, do me a favor. Miranda, put that on a piece of paper for me tomorrow. Shh, don't tell.